In 1944, German police came for a 76-year-old chemist in Berlin. His name was Arthur Eichengrün. He had spent 50 years in German laboratories. He held dozens of patents. The film that coated German aircraft wings in the First World War was his invention, and the German War Ministry had relied on it. They sent him to Theresienstadt anyway. He survived, and when he came out, he sat down and wrote a short account of something that had happened in a laboratory in Elberfeld in the summer of 1897, an account that contradicted the founding story of the largest pharmaceutical company in Europe. He was describing the invention of aspirin, the drug you have in your kitchen drawer right now, the most widely taken medicine in the history of the world, made from a tree bark that healers had used for 4,000 years. And Eichengrün said the man whose name is on it had almost nothing to do with it. The official story says a chemist named Felix Hoffmann invented aspirin to relieve his father's arthritis. There is no document anywhere in the Bayer archive that says so before 1934. 37 years of silence. And then, in the first full year of the Third Reich, a footnote appeared. Before there was a company, there was a tree. And before you can understand what was taken from Arthur Eichengrün, you have to understand what was taken from the plant, because the pattern that erased him had already been rehearsed, on the willow. And if you miss that, the rest of this looks like an accident instead of a habit. In the summer of 1758, an English clergyman walked beside a brook near Chipping Norton in Oxfordshire. His name was Edward Stone. He stripped a piece of bark from a white willow and put it to his lips, and it was bitter. That bitterness meant something to him. The only reliable fever cure in Europe at the time was cinchona bark, shipped from South America at enormous expense, and cinchona was famously bitter too. Stone reasoned that the two might share a property. His reasoning was not what a modern chemist would call sound. He believed in the doctrine of signatures, the idea that God had marked every created thing with a sign pointing to its purpose. Willows grow in wet ground. Fevers, he believed, came from wet ground. In his words, the general maxim that natural maladies carry their cures along with them was, and this is his phrasing, so very apposite to this particular case that he could not help applying it. Wrong theory. He tested it anyway. He dried the bark, he powdered it, and over the next 5 years he gave it to 50 patients suffering from what the 18th century called the ague. On the 25th of April, 1763, Stone wrote to the Earl of Macclesfield, President of the Royal Society. His letter was read aloud to the Society on the 2nd of June that year. It survives. It describes what is arguably the first clinical trial in English medicine, conducted by a country vicar with no medical training on a remedy older than the Roman Empire. The bark brought the fevers down, every time. And then the Royal Society published it, and Europe did nothing with it for 65 years. Now look at what happened when the chemists finally arrived, because this is the moment the plant stopped being a plant. And if you want to know how a 4,000-year-old remedy becomes a corporate asset with a single man's name attached, this is where the transfer starts. In 1827, a professor of pharmacy in Munich named Johann Buchner pulled bitter yellow crystals out of willow bark and named them salicin, after salix, the Latin for willow. 2 years later, a French pharmacist, Henri Leroux, refined the process. Consider his yield: 1.5 kilograms of bark, 30 grams of purified salicin. 2%. That is what 4 millennia of folk medicine amounted to, chemically, a 2% fraction that nobody had been able to see. Hippocrates had prescribed willow bark for fever and for the pain of childbirth 22 centuries earlier, without any idea what was in it. Then the Italian chemist Raphael Perea split salicin into its components. And in 1853, a French chemist named Charles Gerhardt, working on anhydrides, combined salicylic acid with acetic acid and produced a compound he found chemically uninteresting. He wrote it up. He filed it away. He died 5 years later at the age of 39. The compound Charles Gerhardt threw away in 1853 was acetyl salicylic acid. It was aspirin. 44 years before Bayer touched it, sitting in a French journal, unread. Because the problem was never making the molecule. The problem was that salicylic acid, in the form doctors had, tore holes in the stomachs of the patients who took it. Rheumatic patients in the 1890s were being handed a drug that eased their joints and ruined their gut lining. And the pharmaceutical industry knew it. Someone was going to fix that. The question was who would get to say they had. In August of 1897, in the Bayer works at Elberfeld in the Rhine Valley, a young chemist ran a reaction that had been run before. He combined salicylic acid with acetic acid, and this time the product came out pure and stable. The date is on record, the 10th of August, 1897. The chemist's name was Felix Hoffmann, and the story that Bayer has told about that afternoon for 90 years is one of the most repeated origin myths in modern medicine. So listen to it carefully, because every detail in it is load-bearing. The official version goes like this. Felix Hoffmann's father suffered from crippling rheumatism. The salicylate treatments available made him vomit. His son, working in the Bayer laboratory, set out to make a gentler version to help him, and succeeded. A son, a sick father, a cure made out of love. It is a very good story. Pharmaceutical companies do not usually get founding myths that good. Arthur Eichengrün, who was in that building, who was Hoffmann's senior, and who ran the pharmaceutical chemistry group Hoffmann worked in, said in 1949 that he had instructed Hoffmann to make the compound, that Hoffmann's role ended at the bench synthesis, that the plan, the direction, and everything that followed were his. 2 accounts, 1 laboratory. One of them is wrong, so go to the paperwork. That is what a Scottish pharmacologist named Walter Sneeder did in the late 1990s, working through Bayer's own archived letters, laboratory records, and patents. He found no document connecting Felix Hoffmann to the invention of aspirin from 1897, or 1898, or 1899, or any year in the following 3 decades. The earliest internal records point somewhere else entirely, toward Heinrich Dresser, the head of pharmacology at Elberfeld, and toward the man who says he gave the order. 37 years of company paperwork, and the father, the arthritis, and the devoted son appear in none of it. Now look at Heinrich Dresser, because the next part of Eichengrün's account is the part that should have made him famous, and it is the part that costs you the most if you let it slide past. Dresser was not a bystander. He was the gatekeeper. Every compound the chemists at Elberfeld produced had to pass through his department before it went anywhere, and what he did with acetyl salicylic acid nearly ended it. In Eichengrün's account, Dresser tested the compound and rejected it. His stated objection was that acetyl salicylic acid would damage the heart, a belief that was, in the event, entirely wrong. He wrote it off. In Eichengrün's telling, Dresser's verdict was that the substance was of no value. That should have been the end of it. A compound vetoed by the head of pharmacology at a major German firm in 1897 does not get a second hearing. So Eichengrün says he went around him. He took the drug himself first to establish that it was safe. Then he passed it quietly to a colleague, Felix Goldmann, who arranged for physicians in Berlin to try it on patients without going through the company's formal channels. The reports came back. Rheumatic pain relieved. And unlike the salicylates then in use, no ringing in the ears, no wrecked stomach. Eichengrün recorded one physician's report of a patient with toothache who said in his exact words that the pain was gone. Dresser still refused. According to Sneeder's reading of the record, the drug only moved because Karl Duisberg, Bayer's head of research and later the most powerful man in the German chemical industry, intervened over his head. Dresser reinvestigated in September of 1898. This time, the answer was yes. Aspirin went on sale in 1899, which means the most successful drug ever manufactured reached the world against the explicit judgment of the man whose job was to judge it. It was smuggled past its own company. And the man who says he smuggled it is not the man whose name you know. In 1934, a retired chemist named Albrecht Schmidt published a history of German chemical engineering. He had spent his career at IG Farben, the conglomerate that had absorbed Bayer in 1925. Somewhere in that book, in a footnote, he recorded that Felix Hoffmann had synthesized aspirin to help his rheumatic father. That footnote is the origin of the story. Not a laboratory notebook, not a patent, not a letter written in 1897 by anyone who was in the room. A footnote, in a retrospective, written 37 years afterward. So look at the year. Hitler had taken power in January of 1933. Within months, the new government had begun stripping Jews out of German public and professional life, the civil service, the universities, the professions. German industry was rewriting its own records to match. Arthur Eichengrün was Jewish. Felix Hoffmann was not. And in 1934, for the first time in the documented history of the compound, the invention of Germany's most famous export was attributed in print to the Christian chemist rather than to the Jewish one. Walter Sneeder's conclusion, published in the British Medical Journal in December of 2000, was that the accepted account rests on a source that cannot bear the weight put on it, and that the archival evidence supports Eichengrün. His view, stated bluntly to a Scottish newspaper, was that the story had been manufactured so that Germans would not have to know a Jew had discovered the most successful drug in history. That is Sneeder's reading of the evidence. It is not a confession, and no document has ever surfaced in which anyone at IG Farben admits to making the swap. But the timing is the timing. 37 years of nothing, and then a name change in year one of the Reich. Now follow Arthur Eichengrün out of the building, because the erasure of his name was not the worst thing done to him, and the rest of it explains why the correction took half a century to arrive. He left Bayer in 1908 and founded his own firm in Berlin. He worked on cellulose acetate. He developed a flame-resistant coating for aircraft, the material that covered German warplanes in the First World War, when the alternative was a lacquer that turned a hit aircraft into a torch. He was decorated for it. He held more than 40 patents. None of it protected him. After 1933, his company was taken from him under the Aryanization laws. He was expelled from the professional bodies he had helped build. And in 1944, at 76, he was deported to Theresienstadt. He lived 14 months, and he came out alive, which most did not. And then, at last, he wrote it down. In 1949, in the journal Pharmazie, Arthur Eichengrün published his account of what had happened at Elberfeld in 1897, that he had directed the synthesis, that he had run the covert clinical testing, that Hoffmann had followed his instructions, and nothing more. He died the same month it appeared. He had waited 15 years to answer that footnote, and the reason he waited is not difficult to work out. A Jewish chemist in Germany between 1934 and 1945 did not contradict the official history of a national industry and expect to survive it. When it was finally safe to speak, he had months left. Nobody listened. The paper sank without trace. For 50 years, historians and chemists treated it as the resentment of an old man who had been passed over. Now look at what Bayer said when the challenge finally came, because the company has never once conceded this point, and the reasons it gives are not nothing. When Sneeder presented his findings, Bayer issued a denial. Their position is that the credit to Hoffmann is not a 1934 invention at all, and their strongest piece of evidence is a document. The American patent for aspirin, filed in 1899, which names Felix Hoffmann. That is a real objection. It is contemporaneous, and it puts Hoffmann's name on the compound in the year of its release, rather than in the year the Nazis took power. There are counter-objections. A patent names the person who performed the synthesis, which nobody disputes Hoffmann did, and it is a legal instrument, rather than a historical account of who conceived the work. Sneeder's argument was never that Hoffmann was absent from the bench. It was that the direction came from Eichengrün, and that the story about the father and the arthritis, the part that makes it a legend rather than a job, appears nowhere until 1934. So the record sits where it has sat since 2000. The archival evidence supports the man who was deported. The company that holds the archive supports the man whose name is on the box. And the two accounts have not been reconciled by anyone. Walk into any pharmacy on Earth, and the product is there. Aspirin, in the same white tablet, in 150 countries, more than 100 billion doses a year. There is a bark in it that Hippocrates knew about. There is a vicar's 5-year trial in it, and a French chemist who died at 39, not knowing what he had made, and a pharmacologist who said no, and a chemist who took it himself to prove it was safe, and then spent 14 months in a camp built by the government that had rewritten his name out of the story. And on the official history, none of them are there. 4,000 years, that bark was public property. Anyone could strip it off a tree by a river and boil it. Then it was isolated and named and purified and patented and finally attached to a single man. And the man it was attached to was chosen, at least once, on a criterion that had nothing whatever to do with chemistry. Arthur Eichengrün spent his last years trying to put one sentence back into the record. He is still waiting.